They told us the bloodlines were lost, that after 5 centuries of war, plague, and forced forgetting, the indigenous roots of Mexico had faded into myth. A land conquered, they said, its people absorbed into the mestizo melting pot, European on the surface, native only in memory. But the DNA tells a different story, a story that has waited silent, in the bones, in the blood, in the cells of millions. Today, across Mexico, across the Americas, millions of people walk with ancient lineages pulsing through their veins. Lineages far older than the empires that sought to erase them. Here's the contradiction. Genetic studies now reveal that despite half a millennium of European colonization, most modern Mexicans carry more indigenous DNA than European. In some regions, far more. And it's not just random fragments. No. Deep, intact patterns, matrilineal signatures, immune system adaptations, markers of migrations that stretch back over 15,000 years. How? How did these ancient genetic threads survive a demographic collapse that wiped out nearly 90% of native populations? How did they endure through conquest, forced assimilation, waves of migration, to shape not just individual identities, but the genetic architecture of 2 continents? Because here's the deeper revelation. These lineages didn't simply survive. They shaped the Americas. From Alaska to Patagonia, genetic fingerprints of ancient Mexicans ripple outward, encoded in the very genomes of indigenous peoples across the hemisphere. The so-called lost DNA of native Mexico. It was never lost. It was buried beneath colonial myths, beneath racial classifications, waiting for science to see what history tried to hide. And now, as researchers decode the genomes of ancient remains and living descendants, a stunning map is emerging. A map that rewrites the very story of who shaped this land. But to trace it, we must go deeper still. Because beneath these surviving lineages lies a far older journey. A journey that began not in Mexico, nor in the Americas, but in a frozen, forgotten world. So the question is, where did these deep genetic roots truly begin? If you're fascinated by lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries, subscribe for more untold stories. There's a missing chapter in the story of the Americas. A chapter written not in stone, not in legend, but in ice. For thousands of years, before the first footprints marked these continents, a single population of humans was trapped, stranded at the edge of the world, between Asia and a frozen, unrecognizable North America. This was Beringia, a vast land bridge, now swallowed by the sea, that once connected Siberia to Alaska. But during the last glacial maximum, it became a prison of ice. Glaciers blocked the way south. Oceans, frozen solid, sealed the north. And so, the ancestors of all Native Americans remained, generation after generation, isolated in this cold, twilight world, cut off for millennia. In that isolation, something extraordinary happened. A genetic bottleneck, a narrowing of diversity so extreme that every indigenous person alive today carries the legacy of those few survivors. A single ancestral population, shaped not just by drift, but by deep adaptation, encoded into their very DNA. Think about it. From the Amazon rainforest to the Arctic Circle, from the Nahua of Mexico to the Aymara of the Andes, they all descend from this ancient, frozen community. And when the ice finally began to melt, the glaciers retreating, a path opened. Around 16,000 years ago, the long captivity ended. The people of Beringia moved southward, fast, so fast, their descendants reached the tip of South America in just a few thousand years. But there's more. As they surged into the open Americas, that once unified population split. One branch remained in the north, giving rise to Arctic peoples. The other, the southern branch, carried the seeds of what would become the civilizations of Mesoamerica and beyond. Yet even in that first great migration, not all places were equal, because as they journeyed deeper, one land, one region would become the crucible, a genetic heart from which entire continents would be shaped. And that land is where our story now turns. Every great journey leaves its mark on the land, and as the first peoples of the Americas moved south, there was one place they could not bypass: Mexico, a vast, jagged bridge between the continents. Mountains, deserts, rainforests, rivers that twist like veins through the heart of the land. No one passed through untouched. But here's the twist. For decades, historians imagined this region as a highway, a corridor, just to pass through on the way to richer lands farther south. But the DNA tells a different story, because Mesoamerica wasn't just a bridge. It was a crucible, a place where ancient lineages mixed, collided, and began to diverge. Every human who reached South America carried genes filtered through this land. And as archaeologists trace early migrations, one truth emerges: Mexico shaped who made it through. Now, the latest genomic maps reveal something deeper. This wasn't a uniform melting pot. No, it was a crossroads, one that fractured. To the north, the arid lands of what we now call Arido-America. Harsh deserts, nomadic hunter-gatherers. To the south, lush valleys, fertile soils. The cradle of Mesoamerican civilization. Even tens of thousands of years later, this ancient divide is still written in the DNA of their descendants. Two genetic worlds, side by side, each evolving along its own path. And it's here, in this land of contrasts, that the great shaping of the Americas truly began. Because Mexico was not merely a stage for migration. It became a source, a wellspring. From here, genetic legacies radiated outward, north and south, seeding new cultures, new peoples. But while these ancient lineages drifted apart, something else was happening. Something that would transform more than DNA. It would change landscapes, societies, civilizations, and it would spark a revolution unlike any before. A revolution that would change human history. It began with a simple grass. Thin, wild, hardly edible. Teosinte. No one could have guessed that this unassuming plant would rewrite the destiny of a continent. Because what happened next was not just agriculture. It was evolution in both plant and people. Somewhere in the valleys of ancient Mexico, early farmers began a quiet experiment. Season after season, choosing the largest kernels, the most nourishing cobs, shaping the grass into something new. And in doing so, shaping themselves. Teosinte became maize. Maize became life. This was not a slow, passive process. It was a genetic acceleration, on both sides. As maize evolved, so did the people who relied on it. New gut adaptations, immune shifts, even changes in metabolism. The DNA of maize and the DNA of Mesoamericans entwined forever. And maize spread across the trade routes of ancient Mexico, through valleys and mountains. With it traveled genes. Because where maize went, people followed. Communities grew denser. Villages became cities. Civilizations rose, anchored by the steady rhythm of the planting cycle. And with every generation, human genomes shifted, adapting to this new way of life. Today, you can trace that spread in ancient seeds, in archaeological layers, and in the living genomes of indigenous peoples across 2 continents. The path of maize is mirrored in human DNA. But here's the deeper mystery. This genetic transformation wasn't driven by conquest. It wasn't forged by kings or warriors. It was shaped by farmers, by hands in the soil, by the daily, patient work of shaping the land, and being shaped by it in return. Yet even as maize reshaped the human story here, it was not alone, because another force was at work, one even more subtle and even more powerful, a force that would turn Mexico's genetic mosaic into something truly extraordinary. Borders are not always what they seem. On a map of Mexico, the lines of language are clear, boundaries of words, of identity, of culture. But if you strip away the words and peer beneath the surface, the story changes. Because the human genome tells a different kind of map, one drawn not by speech, but by land. For years, scholars believed language defined lineage, that if 2 people spoke different tongues, they must be genetically distant. But now the DNA tells us otherwise. Across Mexico, ancient genetic studies reveal a hidden truth: geography, not language, shaped the deepest divides. Consider this. The Huastec Maya, a linguistic island, speaking a tongue of the distant Maya heartland. Yet their DNA clusters not with fellow Maya of the south, but with their neighbors in central Mexico. Why? Because rivers, mountains, deserts, These were the true barriers, the silent architects of genetic identity. Over millennia, they shaped who mixed and who remained apart. And in some cases, that separation ran so deep, it left marks in the genome as stark as those between entire continents. Among certain indigenous groups in Mexico, the genetic distance rivals that between Europeans and East Asians. Think of that. Two villages, a few hundred miles apart, genetically more distant than London and Beijing. It's a living echo of ancient isolation, of paths not taken, of borders no map can show. Now, with genomic maps laid against linguistic charts, the contrast is startling. Lines once thought to define identity blur. New patterns emerge, written in the code of life itself. But this is not a story of frozen tribes. Because even in these isolated pockets, something was stirring. Movement, contact, exchange. Yet even in isolation, these ancient peoples were anything but static. Civilizations rise from stone and soil. But beneath their walls, beneath their markets and temples, flows something older. Genes, ideas, memory. And here, in ancient Mesoamerica, humans didn't just build cities. They engineered entire worlds. Take Teotihuacan, a city of pyramids and boulevards, alive with color and ceremony. At its height, larger than any European city of the time. But what truly pulsed through its avenues was movement. People, goods, lineages, merchants from the Gulf, jade traders from the Maya lowlands, obsidian carvers from the highlands. And with every exchange, genes moved too. The very fabric of the Americas was being rewoven, through trade, through alliance, through the beating heart of these urban centers. And it wasn't only Teotihuacan. Across the Yucatan, Maya cities rose, each one a hub of cosmic knowledge and coded stone. Their calendars mapped not just the heavens, but cycles of human connection. Ceremonial ball courts echoed with a game far older than empires. A ritual played from Mexico to the deserts of the Southwest. And with each journey, each ball game, each marriage alliance, new strands were spun into the genetic web of the continent. Now, with modern genomic tools, scientists can trace those ancient corridors. Maps of trade routes glowing, overlaid with patterns of shared DNA. From valley to coast, from city to jungle, human genes flowed alongside obsidian blades, cacao, and sacred feathers. Mesoamericans weren't isolated tribes. They were architects, engineers of both ecology and society. They shaped forests, managed rivers, built roads across the land. And through that living network, they forged connections still visible today, in the genomes of millions. But just as this vibrant, dynamic world reached its peak, an invisible force was already on the horizon, an enemy no wall could stop. And soon it would alter this genetic story forever. It came without warning. Not an army, not a king, but something unseen, carried on the breath of strangers. The first Europeans set foot on these shores, and within a generation, entire cities emptied. 90%. In some regions, more. The great markets of Tenochtitlan, once thronged with life, fell silent. Villages vanished. Elders, storytellers, healers, all gone in the span of a single lifetime. Smallpox, measles, influenza, invisible killers for which no immunity existed. But the story of this apocalypse isn't written only in chronicles. It's written in the genome. Modern DNA studies reveal the scars, bottlenecks so deep they compressed entire lineages. Before contact, the genetic diversity of Mexico rivaled that of a continent. Afterward, entire branches of the ancestral tree were pruned away. Some maternal haplogroups, once common, vanished forever. Others survived, but altered. Because in the face of such cataclysm, evolution didn't stop. It accelerated. Under brutal selection pressure, immune-related genes shifted. Variants that offered even the faintest protection spread. Today, deep within indigenous genomes, you can trace these adaptations. Silent witnesses to a time of unimaginable loss. And yet, this is not only a story of extinction, because through it all something endured. Against the odds, against plague and conquest, ancient lineages held on, passed from mother to child, from elder to newborn. Across 5 centuries, their presence still whispers through the blood of millions. And now, As the tools of modern genomics illuminate the past, we see them, clearer than ever, not as relics, but as survivors. Yet even after this apocalypse, ancient lineages refuse to disappear. Walk the streets of modern Mexico. Look into the faces, vendors in Oaxaca, children in Yucatan, families gathered in plazas under fading murals. Ask them about their roots, and many will say the same. I'm mestizo, a blend, part indigenous, part European, a cultural fusion born of centuries of collision. But here's the deeper truth, hidden in their very cells. Most carry far more indigenous ancestry than they've ever been told. Not fragments, not echoes, but deep, enduring lineages. And now, DNA is peeling back the layers. When scientists map modern Mexican genomes, a stunning pattern emerges. The genome is not uniform. It's regional. Specific indigenous signatures still tie people to ancient homelands. In Yucatan, mestizo individuals show clear traces of Maya ancestry. In Oaxaca, Mixtec and Zapotec lineages pulse through modern bloodlines. Even in northern states, echoes of ancient Arado-American tribes remain, etched into the paternal and maternal lines. Overlay modern faces with these genetic maps, and the effect is haunting. Eyes that mirror ancestors from thousands of years past. Genomic corridors that align with ancient trade routes, with migrations older than any written record. Because despite conquest, despite centuries of imposed identity, the DNA endures. And with every genome sequenced, another piece of the true mosaic comes into view. But here lies the deeper twist. The legacy of native Mexicans doesn't stop at these borders. Its influence radiates outward, across continents, across oceans. And now new evidence is revealing connections no one expected. Because the influence of native Mexicans goes even beyond the Americas. For centuries, it was thought impossible. A vast ocean, endless, unforgiving, between the shores of the Americas and the scattered islands of the Pacific. No ships, no charts, no way, they said, for ancient peoples to cross such a distance. But once again, the DNA speaks, and what it reveals shatters old assumptions. Buried deep within the genomes of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, ancient Polynesians who settled the world's most remote inhabited island, lies a signal. A genetic thread that does not come from Asia. It comes from the Americas, from indigenous ancestors who lived and traded along Pacific shores, long before European sails darkened these waters. The evidence is unmistakable. DNA from Native American lineages, traced in the bones of Rapa Nui individuals, dated to before European contact. Somewhere between 1280 and 1495 CE, an encounter took place. But here's the mystery. How? Who made that crossing? Did Pacific navigators reach the coasts of the Americas and return with more than goods? Or did native seafarers themselves set out, long canoes skimming the waves, toward an unknown horizon? And if they did, where did they launch from? Some genetic clues point north, others hint south. But now new models suggest another possibility. That Mexico and its ancient maritime cultures may have played a role far greater than we imagined. Because the coastal peoples of Mesoamerica were not landlocked. They built dugout canoes. They knew the currents, the winds, and across their shores traded obsidian, cacao, jade, goods that traveled far beyond their origins. Could genes have traveled too? The answers are only beginning to emerge. But one thing is now clear. If this oceanic link existed, if native Mexicans and their cousins reached farther than we ever dreamed, then what other ancient connections remain hidden? Beneath the surface of modern Mexico, the ancient map still lingers. Not in stone or fading codices, but in the double helix. Even after collapse, conquest, centuries of erasure, the old patterns remain. When geneticists scan today's mestizo genomes, they find echoes. Pre-Columbian structures, still there. North to south, coast to highlands. Indigenous signatures woven through modern bloodlines. A quiet defiance encoded in the cells of millions. And the parallels run deeper. Because just as these genes endure, so do the voices, the rituals, the wisdom of the land. Languages once forbidden, now spoken again. Songs once silenced, rising in new generations. Traditional medicines, weaving with modern science. Step into a market in Oaxaca. Hear the cadence of Zapotec. Walk the temples of Yucatan. Feel the pulse of Maya ceremony. These aren't relics. They're living legacies. Proof that native Mexicans didn't simply survive history's darkest storms. They shaped it, and they shape us still. Because the DNA tells us something no empire could erase. Native Mexicans didn't just endure. They are who we are. But this is only the beginning. With every ancient genome decoded, with every burial uncovered, new chapters emerge. Connections we've yet to see. Stories we've yet to hear. And if these lineages stretch from the heart of Mexico to the far edges of Polynesia, then what deeper migrations, what forgotten crossings, still wait beneath the sands? Because the past is not finished speaking. And the next revelation is just beyond the horizon.